Hi there, my name is Wendy and welcome to my channel where I share crochet tutorial videos for my projects and techniques. And today I'm going to show you how to make one of these crochet roses. So I'm going to be using UK stitch terminology, and the only techniques that you need to know is how to make a chain, how to make a double crochet and how to make the treble stitch. I have also got a free PDF pattern and chart if you wish to download that as well, and I'll pop the link in above here now and in the description notes below. But you can easily make this rose just by following my YouTube tutorial. Just before we start, if this is the first time to this channel, then please just take a moment to subscribe and click that notification bell, and then you'll get to hear when my next videos and updates go live. Now, to make my rose, I'm going to be using some acrylic UK weight double knitting yarn, and the yarn I'm using today is Stylecraft Special DK, but you can of course use any make of your choice. And along with that, I'm going to be using a 4mm crochet hook. I've got a small pair of scissors to snip my ends afterwards, and I'm going to need a wool type darning needle to stitch my rose around in a spiral afterwards. Now you will also see that I've got some strands of yarn here and some stitch markers. Now you'll need to use either or, you won't be using both. And I've pre-cut 13 pieces of yarn in a different colour, so as I'm working row 1 I can place these little stitch markers in place, and that will show me exactly where I'm going to be putting my petals in row 2. Now, as I said, you can either use short strips of yarn in a different colour, or you can use these padlock type stitch markers. However, for this I prefer to use the little pieces of yarn because I find that these stitch markers are a little bit heavy and they sort of get in the way a bit. But you will probably find that you only need to use the stitch markers the very first time you make one of these roses. Once you've made it once, you'll have the gist of what you're doing, and you'll see exactly where you're going to be making your petals the next time you make one. Just before we start, this is the right-handed video, so if you're left-handed, I'll put a link above here now and in the description box below to take you to the left-handed video. So the first thing that I'm going to do is to make a slip knot, and you can make your slip knot in whichever is your preferred manner, and then I'm going to make 42 chain. Now while I'm making my chain, this is just a quick opportunity for me to remind you that in this video I'm using UK stitch terminology, and you can now pause this video and rejoin me when you've made your 42 chain and we're ready to start row 1. So I've now finished my 42 chain and I'm ready to start working row 1. Now I'm going to create 13 V-type spaces, and as I go along, each time I make a loop, I'm going to place one of these little stitch markers, one of these pieces of yarn in place, so that when it comes to working row 2, I know exactly where I'm working into. So the first thing I'm going to do is miss the first 5 chain underneath the hook, and I'm going to make one UK treble in the 6th chain. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and there is my 6th chain, and I'm going to make one UK treble. So I'm just working into the side of that chain. And I now have this chain space here. So I'm going to take one of my threads and just pop it through that chain space. So that's just there, and then I'm just going to loosely tie it in place, just so it's temporarily there and I can take it out in row 2 when I'm ready. So now I'm going to make one chain. So that's my one chain made. And then I'm going to miss 2 chain, and in the 3rd chain I'm going to make one treble, 2 chain and one treble in exactly the same stitch. So that's one UK treble made, 2 chain, and then I'm going to make another UK treble in exactly the same place as the last stitch. So that's my treble there, and this has created a little V. So if we look at it, we can see this V here. So again, I'm going to take my next thread, and in that V immediately behind my crochet hook, I'm going to pop my thread in, and again just loosely tie that in place. So that's just going to act as a marker for another petal. So now I'm going to make one chain, and I'm going to create another one of these V shapes. So I'm going to miss 2 chain, and in the 3rd chain I'm going to work 1 UK treble, 2 chain, and I'm going to work another UK treble in exactly the same place as that last treble, creating a V-shape loop. Okay, so if we have a look, we can see we've got this V-shaped loop here. So again, I'm just going to pop that down. I'm going to take my next thread and I'm going to pop that through that chain space that I've just created and tie that in place as well. So I've now identified spots for 3 petals in the next row. So again, I'm going to make 1 chain, and then I'm going to make another V-type stitch. So I'm going to miss the next 2 chain, and in the 3rd chain here, I'm going to work 1 treble, followed by 2 chains, and 1 treble in exactly the same spot as that last treble. So again, if I pop this down and you take a look, you can see again that I've just created a V shape just behind my crochet hook. So again, I'm going to take another thread and I'm just going to pop that through the hole and tie that in place. And the reason that I like using these threads instead of stitch markers, as I said before we started, is there's no weight to them, so it doesn't cause any sort of distortion or dangling. So again, I'm going to make one more. I'm going to make 1 chain, and then I'm going to make another V-type shape. So I'm going to miss the next 2 chains in my foundation chain, and in the 3rd chain I'm going to work 1 treble, 2 chains, and 1 treble in exactly the same place, and then pop my next little strand of yarn through that V shape. So I'm creating these markers, and it will save a lot of time when you're working row 2, because you'll just be able to see exactly where you're working those petals. So if we can take a look at it now, we can see that we've got these V shapes and we've also got a gap between each of them. So I'm going to work along now to the end of my foundation chain here, and it's just 1 chain, miss the next 2 foundation chain, and in the 3rd foundation chain you're going to be making 1 treble, 2 chains, and 1 treble. Okay, so make my next one, and again I'm ready to put my marker in my little chain space behind my hook. So I'm going to continue working this manner all the way till I get to the very end, and you should have 13 V-type spaces, and you should have used up all your little strands of yarn or stitch markers. So I'll meet you when I get to the end of this row and we're ready to work row 2. So I've now finished, and as you can see, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 little strands of yarn, showing me exactly where I'm going to be making my 13 petals in row 2. And if I just open this up a little bit more, you can see that I've created a type of frill, and I've got the V shapes here with the stitch marker in, and between each V shape I've got a 1 chain space. So now when it comes to working row 2, we're going to be working a shell into each of these V's where we've got our little threads. So the first thing that I'm going to do is to make a turning chain, and I'm going to make a 3 chain to turn. So that's my 3 chain made. I'm now going to turn round, and I know that I'm making my first petal where I've got this coloured thread. So I can take this thread out now, and I'm going to be working 5 UK trebles in this V shape here. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So that's my first petal made. Now, before we get to the next petal, we've got the 1 chain space that we made in row 1 between each of these V shapes. So in this 1 chain space here, I'm just going to make 1 UK double crochet stitch. So I'm now at my next V shape where I've got my coloured thread. So I'm going to take that out. And again, I'm going to make a shell in this V shape using 5 trebles. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. There we go. So we've got 2 petals made, and these petals are going to be in the center of the rows, so they're going to be slightly smaller than the rest of the petals. So now I've got my 1 chain space here just before I get to my next V space where I'm going to make my 3rd petal. So in this 1 chain space here, I'm going to make 1 UK double crochet. And now I'm ready to work my 3rd petal. So I'm going to take my coloured thread out. But in this petal, I'm going to work 7 UK trebles. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, because we just want our petals to get a little bit thicker, just have a bit more definition now as we're working away from the center of the flower. So now I've got another chain space before I reach my 4th petal. So again, it's 1 double crochet. So it's always going to be 1 double crochet in the chain space between your petals. So now I'm going to make 7 UK trebles in this 4th petal here. So I'm going to take my thread out, and I'm going to work 7 UK trebles to make this 4th petal. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 trebles to make that 4th petal. So if we have a look at it now, you can see that we're making this frill of petals, and it will be wavering, and it should be wavering. That's how you want it to be, so that as it curls up, it will naturally turn in on itself. So again, I'm back to a chain space before I reach the next V where the next marker is. So I'm just going to make 1 UK double crochet stitch in that chain space. And now I'm at my 5th petal, so I'm going to take the marker out. And again, I'm going to be making 7 UK trebles in that V space to create my 5th petal. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Okay, so that's 5 petals now made. So the first 2 petals had 5 UK trebles in them, and then the next 3 trebles here, 1, 2, 3, they had 7 UK trebles in each petal. So now we've got a chain space again before we get to our next petal, which is going to be our 6th petal. So we're going to make 1 UK double crochet stitch, and then we can take our little marker out, and then in this petal and all the rest of them to the end of the row, we're going to be making 9 UK trebles in our shells. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. So our petals are getting nice and full now, and our work will be frilling even more. It will feel very crowded, but that's right, that's exactly how you want it to be. So again, we're back to that chain space before we get to the next V shape where the marker is. So we're going to pop 1 UK double crochet in that chain space again, and then we're at our next petal, so we take our stitch marker out, and again it's 9 UK trebles. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Okay, so now we're going to work the rest of our petals in exactly the same manner. So we're going to make 1 double crochet in the chain space between these V shapes where the markers are. So I'm going to make my 1 double crochet here in the chain space between the petals. And then in each of these V shapes where we've got the stitch markers, we're going to be working 9 UK trebles and then 1 UK double crochet in the chain space in between. So I'm going to carry on making my petals all the way till I get to the end, and then I'm going to rejoin you there and just show you how I finish off before we start to sew up our rows. So I've now made 12 petals and I'm now back at the very last loop. And don't worry if you feel this last loop looks a little bit different. It will do. It was the very first chain space loop that you made in row 1. And this loop consisted of 6 chain. So it does feel just slightly different. So I'm just going to work my 9 trebles in this last loop. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And now I can fasten off. Okay, so I'm just going to cut my yarn, leaving enough yarn to darn in afterwards, and then just pop my yarn around the hook one more time and flick it off, and that will just secure it. And I'm just going to take out that stitch marker. I could have taken that out at the beginning of making this petal, but it doesn't matter. And so now we have this rather frilled and full little edge that wants to spiral around on itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold in the shorter end. If you remember, the very first 2 petals we made were the smaller ones, and so I'm just going to fold that first petal down and just stitch it in place with the end of the yarn here. So I'm just going to thread my needle and make a couple of little over sewing stitches. And then I'm just going to fasten off and lose the end of the yarn in my work. So I've just fastened that off, and I'm just going to run that along that foundation chain a little bit. Okay, so I'm just going to run it along there, and then I can just snip my end. So we know that's the center of our rose. So I'm now going to get a fresh piece of yarn, and you need enough to sew the rose up. So I would allow about 18 to 24 inches of yarn, and I'm just going to pop a knot in it to secure the other end. And I'm going to just pop it in at that bud edge of the rose again. So now what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be rolling the rose around and then just catching it in. Now, if you roll the rose very, very tightly, you're going to get a bud type effect. So I'm just going to show you physically with my hand here, so you can get a very tight effect with your rose. And if you do it very loosely, you'll get a far more open effect. So you want to just balance it so that you get your rose how you'd like it to be. So I'm just going to fold it around a little bit, and then I'm going to catch it in place underneath, going through the whole thing. So I'm catching everything in place at the base. Okay, so now I'm going to roll it around a little bit more. I'm going to have a look at my rose, check that it's how I want it to appear, turn it upside down, and then again I'm going to be taking my needle through the whole thing. And then I'm going back the other way, catching the center of the rose as I go. So I'm making these stitches going through everything, holding it in place. So I'm going to turn the rose up to look at me, and I'm going to wrap it around a little bit more. Okay, then I'm going to turn it upside down again, and I'm going to catch in these outer edges, go through the rose, and again back to the other side. And I'm moving my stitches around, so I'm trying to catch all different areas, taking it through the center, so I'm catching everything into place. And I can turn it up the right way again, and I'm going to roll my little frill around a bit more, wind it round. You can see it wants to actually wind around on itself, so it is quite straightforward. It is quite easy because it wants to curl round in exactly the way that you want it to go. So again, I'm now going to start catching from the center going outwards now as well. So I'm trying to hold everything into place. So now I'm doing some over sewing stitches. So you're doing a mixture now of sewing around the edge of the rose, and you're going to be going through the center as well. And now I just want to catch in this very last piece of the petal here. So I'm just going to trail that back towards the center so that I hide it, so that I haven't got the edge of the petal sticking out. So I'm just going to let that fold in on itself and take my yarn across. And now I can finish off. So I'm just going to do a little over sewing stitch, take my yarn through to secure it, and then I'm going to just lose my yarn in the middle of the back of the rose. Snip my ends. Then I've just got one final end here that I'm just going to lose into the middle of the rose again. So I'm just going to pop that through into the flower. Snip the end. And that is my little rose complete. So I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial and making your rose. So don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell so you get to hear when my next tutorials come out. And for now, I'll just say thanks for watching, thanks for joining me, happy crocheting, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Bye!